Welcome to the Digital Planning Podcast. This series is designed to educate individuals about all things digital in connection with estate planning, business planning, and estate and trust administration. To keep up with all things digital, please subscribe to iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And now, Jennifer Ziegel, a partner at Kleinbard LLC, Ross Brook, a principal at Estate Genie, and Justin Brown, a partner at Ballard Spahr LLP, with today's topic.
Welcome back to the Digital Planning Podcast. I'm Jen, and I'm here with my co-hosts, Justin and Ross, and we have a terrific guest joining us today, Dean Saxe. Dean is the Principal Security Engineer of Identity Access Management at Remitly, and he is also the co-chair of the Death and the Digital Estate Community Group, the DADE CG, which is a working group that is part of the OpenID Foundation that enables interested parties to develop the use cases that support an individual's right to choose what happens to their digital data at death or incapacity. Dean, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
You're absolutely welcome. I'm happy to be here and join you both.
Excellent. So, Dean, tell us how the DADE CG really began.
So it's a story that actually goes back quite a long time, 15 years. Back in the 2000s, I was consulting. I was doing penetration testing and security consulting for a consultancy that dealt with lots of companies around the world. And so it meant that I was traveling a fair bit and became very close friends with another consultant named Roman. And in 2009, after moving to Seattle, we both left the consultancy and went off and had our own careers. And I was sitting at my office at the Gates Foundation, and I got a call from the front desk saying, we have someone calling for you. They didn't know your direct number. And I picked up the phone, and it was a voice I didn't recognize. And he said hi and introduced himself, told me who he was. And he was the brother-in-law of my friend Roman. And Roman had passed away unexpectedly at 39, leaving behind a wife, 2 young kids, and a digital estate that, both being in security, Roman had locked down his digital data quite significantly to the point where his wife and his kids were not able to access their common digital assets, things like family photos. And that led me to start thinking about this problem of how do we deal with one's digital assets? How do we deal with the credentials you have, your passwords, your passkeys, et cetera? And early in this journey, my thought was, we need like a dead man switch. So, if I don't touch this thing for 90 days, if I don't check in for a certain period of time, then all of my credentials would be released to the person of my choosing. But at the time, most people weren't using password managers. And so this wasn't really an accessible mechanism for most people to use. And so I kind of put it on the back burner and thought about it off and on over the years. And in the intervening years, my career actually took me into the realm of identity. And that's what I've been doing for now almost 15 years. And as part of that, I did a lot of work with the FIDO Alliance, which, if you're not familiar with FIDO, they're the team behind what is now called passkeys, which are a passwordless mechanism for authenticating to your accounts that you're seeing roll out more and more through Facebook and Apple and Google and other services. And as I saw the rise of passkeys, I realized that with passkeys, every person who uses these passkeys is going to need some sort of a tool, like a password manager or a passkey manager, to manage their credentials. And so started having conversations with some of my colleagues in the identity space about this idea, again, of this dead man switch for your credentials. And that led to a conversation with some friends in Berlin over drinks late into the evening. And one of those friends, a year later, actually passed away, also quite young, an icon in my industry and a mentor to me. And upon his passing, I sat down with a number of my colleagues and said, okay, now is the time. We really need to do something about this. And so we spent a couple of months writing up proposals, talking to folks at the OpenID Foundation, and eventually had a charter together for the OpenID Foundation to charter DADE, which happened last September. That'd be September 24. And in November of 24, we started meeting and having conversations to try and figure out, how do we, as people working in identity, working on internet technologies and protocols, how do we really begin to solve this problem for humans worldwide. And I think we both knew that the problem was large and complex, but I don't think we actually knew how big and complex this problem was, and how questions of law and culture and technology and personal choice all sort of fit into solving this big, gnarly problem around dealing with our digital estates. But that's what we spent the past year working on, is trying to unwind what the problems are, and some use cases that we have that we need to solve for. And that led us to the conversation we're having today.
And Dean, you write a white paper about all of this, right? Can you summarize for the audience some of the findings there and help them identify it?
Yeah, sure. So the white paper was released as a public preview in late September from the OpenID Foundation. And in the white paper, myself and my two co-authors, Mike Kaiser and Heather Flanagan, basically did a survey of the state of the law worldwide based upon our non-lawyer perspective of the world, the state of technology and the state of culture, and how those things intersect with each other when it comes to talking about and planning for a digital estate. So, for instance, Heather covered quite a lot of the content on the existing state of the law and some of the things that we're seeing come about in various parts of the world. And so, obviously, we have laws like RUFADA here, which covers some aspect of digital assets. And I know the lawyers in the room are much more capable of discussing this than I am. But we also see places like Japan, where there's active guidance now from the government in Japan to individuals about how they should handle their digital credentials and how they should hand them over to their loved ones before they pass away. I took on much more of the technology aspects, looking at how we have tools in places like Facebook and Google and Apple that allow us to set up legacy accounts or legacy managers for our accounts, but they all work slightly differently and they all have different rules associated with them. So for instance, if you have a legacy account, a legacy manager for your Apple account, and you store your passwords and passkeys and other credentials in the Apple Passwords application, those will never be transitioned to your loved ones. Now, from a privacy perspective, this is great, but if you are expecting that your loved ones will get access to your account and then get access to all of the data to unlock every other account, you'd be making a mistake there. And so this is maybe different from how, say, a legacy account with 1Password works, where you can pass on your credentials to your loved ones upon your passing. And Mike very capably took on the realm of culture and religion, and how different religions around the world deal with the concept of death and the celebration of death, or other celebrations around death, and how that influences how we as standards developers need to think about what is the role of culture and religion, as well as the role of law, in designing standards for managing our digital accounts posthumously. And so from those three different perspectives, law, technology, and culture, ultimately we have to now figure out, how do we develop protocols that can survive in this very complex space where we've got these intersecting concerns that will operate differently depending on what region of the world you live in, what your religious beliefs are, what your cultural beliefs are, and what the legal constraints are in the area where you live and operate. And so it's a complex problem that I don't think we knew quite how complex it was when we started down this path.
So, Dean, one of the pieces in the white paper that I thought was really interesting was the distinction, or the discussion about the distinction between delegation and impersonation. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the interplay between the two and how it's a problem from a digital assets perspective.
That is such a fantastic question. I think one that is truly underappreciated as we begin talking about this with other folks. And so let me start with some definitions. So impersonation is the idea that if I hand my estate manager or somebody my credentials, my password, for instance, they can log into my account and they become me. For all intents and purposes, if I give you my credentials to, say, Facebook, and you log into Facebook, you are operating as Dean. You can like things, you can post things, you can do whatever you want as me. Delegation, on the other hand, is generally considered much more constrained. So in a delegation scenario, and this would be like the Apple legacy account scenario, what I've done is during my lifetime, I have set up somebody to be my legacy manager in Apple, and they have their own credentials they can log in with. Once Apple has proof of death, I think generally a death certificate is sufficient for Apple. And that delegated access is limited in scope. That person is clearly not me. It is somebody operating under my authority with the delegation that I have given them and with limited authority. And as I said before, with the passwords example, with the Apple Passwords app, the user is unable to get to the Passwords app and the content of that app, but they are able to get, say, photos or other explicit materials that I have designated should be granted to them. Now, as a security nerd, as an identity nerd, the difference is very meaningful to me because one of the challenges we see with impersonation are things like where a politician has passed, and if prior to your death, you have given access to somebody through this mechanism of impersonation by handing over your credentials, they can not only look at all of your accounts and take action as if they were you, but it could actually result in financial harms if you gave them, say, access to financial accounts and they were able to move money. And so there's a strong reason to not want to allow for impersonation. However, the current state of play in the market is that much of the digital asset management that happens is done via impersonation because we haven't established a universal set of mechanisms to provide delegated access to all of the service providers that are out there. And so, though it may not meet legal muster, a lot of the guidance that we see in the world today is, give your credentials, give your passwords, your passkeys, etc., to a trusted individual who will take care of things after you pass away, which is, again, that impersonation pattern. A few companies, like I mentioned, Apple, for example, do the delegated access. And I think that is the pattern we should all be aiming toward in the future, both to protect the security of the user's data and their accounts, but also to ensure that only the access that is desired by the data owner is granted to the delegated individual upon the data owner's death, thereby limiting the scope of access to what is necessary and reasonable and not allowing this sort of broad level of access that could result in harms.
Thank you for that, Dean. And I do want to just point out, as many of our listeners know and appreciate, impersonation in the context that Dean has provided is against the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the Stored Communications Act, and the majority of terms of service agreements with service providers also prohibit impersonation. So it's a really big issue. And in connection with the Apple Legacy Manager, I do think it's very interesting that while the passwords won't transfer as part of the legacy contact delegation of access, if you're alive, you can actually create through the password manager now shared access to give other people direct information and your credentials to various digital accounts. Then that's cut off at passing.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think a lot of the credential managers out there, Apple Passwords, Google Password Manager, 1Password, et cetera, all support a pattern like that where you can grant access to others to those credentials. But it is unclear to me with all of them what happens once the data owner has passed, what the next step is. And that seems to be distinct based upon the particular password manager or credential manager, whatever you want to call it, that you happen to choose during your lifetime.
And I think you guys even went into more detail about some of the threats that there could be with delegation, whether it's elder abuse or if there's a partner or domestic abuser who are taking advantage of these delegated rights that they've been given.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is an area that we as security professionals need to be thinking about in terms of what are the new risks that are created as we look at how to deal with your digital estate and how to deal with access, whether it's delegated access or impersonation. In both cases, we know there can be harms. And part of our job in security and in identity is to identify those harms and figure out how to reduce them. We can't always eliminate all of the potential harms, but we can figure out how to manage them and drive them down to a reasonable level. But it also, there is an obligation of an individual who is planning their own digital estate and thinking about how they want to hand over access to be aware of the potential harms so they can avoid them. And so there's two sides to this. It's the obligation of platform providers and others who are working on this problem, and it's the obligation of individuals to understand how these harms can come to pass and how to prevent them in their own life. And this is why in all of the work that we've done, we have been very, very clear that we are approaching this from an academic perspective. We encourage everybody to seek legal advice for their own circumstances, for their own digital estate planning purposes, but we will give some guidance based upon our assembled knowledge and information. But everybody should work with competent professionals when planning their digital estate to ensure that they and their data and their other assets have been protected.
So a few moments ago, you mentioned passkey, and that's a good example of how technology changes very rapidly in this area. Does that make you more optimistic or more pessimistic about helping to address this problem? Are you seeing that new ways of accessing data and securing data are coming about so quickly that it's getting harder and harder, or because the entire idea of digital assets was fairly new within the last, let's call it 20 years, but probably really the focus is even shorter, and we're starting to address it. So where do you go on that scale of optimistic versus pessimistic of addressing these issues?
As someone who's worked in security for 25 years, I should probably be more pessimistic, but I'm going to take an optimistic approach on this one. But I don't think it's passkeys that really make the difference here. I think passkeys are something that all of us are getting used to and all of us are going to be using in the next couple of years and more as more and more services adopt passwordless technologies. But passkeys aren't really the thing they're simply a password replacement that we're going to see more and more of. What actually excites me is other technology. The most significant one is what we would call a verifiable credential. These are effectively digitally signed statements that can prove your identity. So you may be familiar with, say, mobile driver's licenses. Mobile driver's licenses are a great example of a verifiable credential. It is issued by, in the US, the state. So the state issues you a driver, you get pulled over by the police for speeding, and you have to present your digital driver's license, and this can be validated electronically. But it can also happen across the internet. And it's the latter part that's really interesting, because this technology now provides mechanisms that can be used to prove who you are much more reliably than, say, the traditional mechanisms of, give me a username and a password, which doesn't prove who you are. It just proves that you have the credential. And when we widen our view a little bit and look at this, now we have tools that allow us to not only prove things like who you are, but we can also use a similar mechanism of verifiable credentials to provide digital death certificates, digital birth certificates. And so we can begin to tie the life events of an individual human to these digital credentials and use those to demonstrate events that happen in their lives, like marriage, for instance. And so this now starts to allow us to build up more digital controls around society and use these in order to say, when somebody passes away, we can consume a digital death certificate that is verifiable cryptographically. It doesn't require a human to look at a piece of paper and say, yes, this looks real. And we can automate all of this. And so that now creates opportunities for businesses to consume this data digitally and be able to respond digitally in a very much of a digital first orientation of their business to these events in order to allow a legacy contact to now take over access, whether it's delegated or through handle the deceased's assets in the way that the deceased wanted them to be handled. And so I think this will enable some new business opportunities, and I kind of alluded to some of the new potential protocols that we could develop based on these technologies within the white paper. And one of the things that we will do in 2026 through the DADE community group is actually start working on developing a working group. The difference being a working group has the ability within the OpenID Foundation to actually develop protocols that become standards, and those standard protocols can then be consumed by companies like Google, Apple, Microsoft, whomever, to build on top of those protocols and build solutions to these problems. And so just like we built on top of the protocol of HTTP to build the web, we will build on these digital identity protocols like verifiable credentials to help build the next version of systems that operate on the web, online, and in some cases in dealing with your digital estate.
So let me put you on the spot for a second, Dean. If we have the ability to use these digital identities, digital driver's licenses, and I know Apple just permitted passports in your Apple Wallet, why are we not using them more widely in the storage and security of, say, digital assets?
It's a very interesting question. And the way I would answer it is first by saying we're in the very early days of the transformation of the internet through digital identity documents, such as verifiable credentials and mobile driver's licenses. It is only in 2025 that we first saw web browsers start to embrace mechanisms for you to reasonable security controls to protect the privacy of the humans who are on the web and who are using these things and want to use them to, say, buy restricted items that you might be able to buy online, but you need to prove your identity to do so. In California, that could be things like spray paint, or generally across the US, we can think of things like alcohol or tobacco. So we're starting to see that transformation happening in 2020. So as that happens, that will then begin to change the marketplace of data protection for your digital assets. So one of the areas that I've worked on for years is this problem of how do I do account recovery? If I've lost access to my Facebook account, how do I regain access in a trustworthy way? And we know there are a lot of bad actors out there that take advantage of weak account recovery mechanisms to gain access to people's accounts and their data. We see this in large-scale attacks against companies like Clorox and MGM, but we also see this in more small-scale targeted attacks against people. And so these kinds of digital credentials, these digital identity documents, provide a much stronger mechanism for us to prove who we are, so that we're not just another dog on the internet, to go back to the 1995 or whatever New Yorker cartoon, but actually prove I am Dean, and here is strong evidence that I am Dean, in order to take these actions like account recovery. And so my prediction is it will begin to change how people interact online, but it will also change how bad actors interact online, and the kind of activities that bad actors use to compromise data and assets, because it's going to get harder and harder for them to say they're me when they're clearly not. And so they're going to have to change those actions. Ultimately, though, as with we are always trying to grow and get better and better defenses. But even as our defenses get better, the attacks get better as well. So we will continue to do the good work that's necessary on our side, but we are always going to have to keep building up these defenses to make sure that we are protecting ultimately the people that we serve. And
so lots of issues involved, a lot from the consumer side, a lot from the proprietor, or the tech companies, and then from the government as well. Who is positioned to help solve this issue best? And what does that look like in the future in sort of your ideal world?
In an ideal world, there would probably be some partnership between government and technology companies to make this happen. I'm not sure I see that happening, at least not in the US in the near term. Maybe in other regions that might happen. And so that leaves it really up to the larger tech companies to solve this issue. Whether they will or not is an interesting question. It is clear, and we've talked a bit already about Facebook and Google and Apple and some of the tools that they have in place already. Some of the tech companies are very much thinking about this, or very much operating in this space and thinking about how to resolve these issues of your digital data, your digital assets, and the ownership of them over the long term. I think have this long history pushing on consumer companies to provide appropriate means for us to transition this data to our loved ones. My biggest fear, and has been for many years, is that with the rise of digital photography and all of the digital photos that everyone's taking, very few people actually back them up or have any consideration for how to manage those over the long term. And so, no longer can I just stuff a box of photos in a shoebox in my closet or under my bed and then they get passed on to my heirs. We need to actually proactively think about this. And so, in addition to the tech companies taking some action and building tools, there's also a bit of a obligation on society to talk about this as a problem and talk about what is it that we are each individually going to do to make sure that our collective history isn't lost. And so ultimately it's a complex problem. I don't think there's a single one place that can solve this problem or answer this problem. But I think it's up to all of us working in this space to talk to each other and make sure that we're doing the right thing to ensure the data is protected and the data which needs to be passed on is passed on. And that extends to obviously estate planning lawyers as well in thinking about this and not just treating it as, the internet is no longer just a plaything or a toy. It's an important part of our everyday lives.
Dean, since the white paper has been published, what type of reactions have you received from different industries?
It's been interesting, which is definitely on our to-do list at this point. But we've also had just a lot of individuals come to us and say, I had no idea this was even a thing. And I can tell you, when starting my new role at Remitly just a couple of weeks ago, I had a conversation with one of our privacy officers here who said to me, I'm so glad you're doing this work. This is something that we have to think about as a company that deals with individual humans and financial assets. We deal with people who pass away in our business. And so it's helpful to have better ways to think about this. The response has also been a bit more muted than I thought. I thought we would have had more input from the large tech firms to engage with us, to talk about the white paper, to provide some feedback for the white paper. I was a little disappointed that we didn't see that. I've had some private communications with some of the larger tech firms. Some are more amenable to change than others. I hope that changes over time. Maybe where we have to get to is having actual real protocols that people can consume and use to make these systems more real, and time will tell as we continue forward with this work. But that is, I guess, the one disappointment, is to say, love this, hate this, didn't care which way they took it, but I just would love to have had more engagement from them to help us collectively move forward.
Interesting. In the white paper, you do emphasize, as kind of part of this continuing discussion, that digital estate norms differ dramatically across cultures, some prioritizing memorialization, others deletion, and others continuity. So as we approach this problem as a collective, how can we incorporate standards that will be really more global and not impose a Western-centric concept of death and legacy?
That is something that has been on my mind a lot as we started this work with DADE. And I will tell you, one of the early conversations we had in the DADE community group was with somebody who was born in China and said very clearly, I don't like the fact that we use the word death. Culturally, this was something that was very challenging for this person. And have to take that under advisement as we have these conversations. And that started me thinking about these cultural concerns. Ultimately, I think from a protocol perspective, when we think about how to design digital protocols to handle this solution, we have to design the protocols to be as open and flexible as possible. So the protocol should allow somebody to express their wishes, express who they wish to, say, leave their digital estate to. And that may be an individual, it may be an institution, it may be multiple individuals and institutions. But we have to design the protocols in a way that allows very open expression of the desires of the data owner and what they want to happen. So We are just now starting to go through the white paper within the DADE community group and start to pull out some requirements from the white paper so that we can start thinking about what protocols will look like in the future. And this will definitely inform that work. Ultimately, my intention is that the protocol should be more about connecting people with the assets, but it is up to the individual services, the Googles and Apples and Facebooks of the world, to provide the tools to say how those assets can be handled by the estate. So whether they are deleted, whether a service is memorialized, like a Facebook memorialization type of a page, etc. Those, I think, have to be handled by individual services because everybody has a different way of managing their data, and it would be nearly impossible to create a universal mechanism that works for all of the services. But where we can create the mechanisms is the mechanisms that connect the data owner, their legacy managers, one or more people or institutions, as I said, and potentially their legal representation, so that the service understands who should get the data and how, and then under the rules of the service and the choices made by the individual, how that data should be dispositioned upon death. This is going the services with the legacy managers. There are potential privacy leaks there, and people lead complex lives. They may have multiple partners that don't know about each other, or they may have others. There may be other things in their life that they don't want to be exposed. Maybe even, but certainly before they die, but maybe even after they die. And so all of these things need to be accounted for in our design to make sure that we leak as little data as possible and protect the individual, both when they're alive and after they've passed. And so there's going to be a lot of thought in the design about what these individual risks are and how we manage them. And I would say that this is just generally a fairly common concern amongst people working in security and identity, but even more so here, given the sensitivity of the topic that we're dealing with when dealing with the death of an individual.
Digital secrets, yes. Data that can bite, for sure. So, Dean, what's the best place for people to find out more information about the white paper or get involved with the DADE CG?
Yeah, so the best way to find both is through the OpenID Foundation's website, which is openid.net. And if you go to openid.net, the data that they have and where, if you visit openid.net and find those assets, that would be great. I would also love to encourage your listeners to join us at the OpenID Foundation within the DADE community group and eventually a future working group, because we need help from others who are interested in this space to continue this work, to develop these protocols and figure out how we expose the broader world to this problem and the potential solutions, because this is a problem we can only solve through collective action. This is not an individual problem. This is very much of a societal problem that we have to solve collectively. And so I'd love to have your listeners come and join us there.
I love that call to action because teamwork really does make the dream work. Dean,
absolutely.
Thank you so much for coming on the show and taking time to tell us about the DADE CG and your white paper that you authored with Mike Kaiser and Heather Flanagan, The Unfinished Digital Estate, Cultural, Law, and Technology After Death. I hope all of our listeners check that out. And on behalf of myself, Justin, and Ross, thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Digital Planning Podcast, the podcast designed to educate individuals about all things digital in connection with estate planning, business planning, and estate and trust administration. Please subscribe to this podcast and leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.